Welcome to Threat Vector, the Palo Alto Network's podcast, where we discuss pressing cybersecurity threats and resilience and uncover insights into the latest industry trends. I'm your host, David Moulton, Director of Thought Leadership. Today I'm speaking with Mike Spisak, Managing Director of Proactive Security at Unit 42. Mike leads efforts to help organizations bolster their cybersecurity posture by staying ahead of emerging threats and implementing proactive security measures. With extensive experience in safeguarding various sectors, today we're going to talk about securing educational institutions, an increasingly critical topic as schools and universities have become a prime target for cyber attacks. With the rapid adoption of digital learning tools and the vast amount of sensitive data that they handle, education institutions are particularly vulnerable. We'll discuss how these institutions can strengthen their defenses and protect their students, faculty, and data from malicious actors. Here's our conversation. Mike Spisak, welcome back to Threat Vector. Good to have you again.
Great to be here.
So we're here at Black Hat. Where do you normally operate out of?
I normally operate, you mean on a day-to-day basis?
On a day-to-day.
Yeah. At an undisclosed location in the hills of New York. I'm just kidding. I'm close to Manhattan. I'm about an hour outside of Manhattan. I like to,
Beautiful country over there.
Yeah, very nice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how you got into cybersecurity for a minute.
Sure.
What drew you to this space? What keeps you in this space?
So those are two really good questions. I'll break it apart super quick. Like many young folks, I had no idea what I wanted to do, right? I was bouncing around, doing a variety of things. I was playing in a band, in a punk rock band. I was doing magic. I was doing a variety of different things. But I started to kind of lean towards business. My father was an accountant, and I guess I figured I would just head that way. Anyways, long story short, while I was at one of my colleges, I ended up rooming with a bunch of hackers. Now, when I say hacker, right, I mean these were the types of folks that would take apart something to understand how it works and then reassemble it potentially better. They challenge conventional wisdom, right? They're just, unique individuals. And they sort of exposed this world of tinkering and hacking. And I started to discover my love for technology there. And I immediately switched my major.
I love it. So you saw a group of people that were curious.
Yeah.
And you too were curious, and it was exciting.
Yeah.
And you became a lifelong passion of hacking, and maybe in the way the term was originally put together.
Correct.
Less about a nefarious intent and more of a curious, how does this work?
You're exactly right. In fact, it's funny, on the way over to Black Hat, I had a quick conversation with my Uber driver about that exact topic, right? He said, oh, well, Black Hat, white hat, gray, and so we started to talk about that. And I won't go on too much of a tangent, but I thought it was interesting that people hear the term hacker and they still think nefarious, cyber criminal. And I explained, you're right, decades ago, right, the term really was born of just to identify individuals who enjoyed taking things apart to understand how they worked, right? And then potentially extend them and enhance them and make them better. So,
of course, you had a very different cab ride over. My guy told me how awesome the Phish concert is here at the Sphere, and it does look pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So we're getting it together today to talk about cybersecurity in the educational space.
Yeah.
I had a conversation with one of our customers a couple months ago, and I was just blown away by some of the things that Gregory Jones is doing to drive security into the university and the gamut of things that he has to cover. And I wanted to come in and get a different perspective. He's in the middle of it. Day to day. You're thinking about proactive security. You're thinking about ways that we can make an investment in time, technology, policy now that gets a result later.
Yeah.
And I think that's different than what a CISO's charged with. There's some of that proactive, but there's reactive, there's in the moment, there's administration. And so I think you have a much more concentrated focus. And the education space in general is one where a lot of big attacks have occurred.
Yeah.
It's a vulnerable space and one that can't put all of its money towards security. It's got to balance things.
Yeah.
So you're facing those constraints. I'm wondering, well, as an institution, you're facing those constraints. I'm wondering what you think are some of the most cost-effective ways
Mhm.
for an education institution, be that a primary school, high school, getting into higher ed. What are the things they can do to improve their security posture?
Yeah. So before I answer that exact question, there was a lot there to unpack. So if we don't, just to rewind super quick, and you're correct. So my day job is proactive security. And you're right. Very often, reactive gets the headlines because, someone will finally go buy a garden hose when they realize something's on, when the house is on fire, right? So it's like, well, why didn't you just put those measures in place to begin with, right? So you're right. That's where I spend a lot of my time trying to help. And the way I do that is I help clients get a risk-based sort of a veneer or lens, right, on the things that are going on day to day, right? So they can begin to start to think about them in a more proactive fashion. That's important because, again, to use that analogy, right? The house is burning down. That shouldn't be the time where you should start thinking about investments, right? You want to do that beforehand, right? That's why, and I think you and I talked about this once before. I like to consider myself almost like a fire marshal, right? Or a fire inspector, someone that would come in and show you where your risks are lying. That also being said, to pivot over into the education space, I think you're correct. They've seen a lot of attacks, and there's a number of reasons for that, and we'll probably go through some of them. But they are vulnerable and susceptible to attacks for a variety of different reasons. And then the other thing I'll say is that I do have a soft spot personally for the education space. My mother's a teacher, my sister's a teacher. I have uncles who are teachers and professors, and it does span from everything from K through 12 and upward in college and university, right? So I think they all need help, right? And then there's a tremendous amount of resources available to them, both from the public sector as well as the private sector, that we could talk through as well, that I think will help them get organized. I think that's the other aspect of it. It's just, how do you organize all of this? So now to your question around budget constraints, what are some of the just basic blocking and tackling types of things that can go, that they can do? And I like things in three, so I'll just try to summarize, because there's a lot, right? And we could spend a day talking about it, but I think I'll take it in three. So the first one, and I always go here, is passwords, right? We talk a lot about passwords in cyber in general. Passwords are hard because, you have to remember them, you have to make them unique, and you have to make them complex, and then you have to store them, you have to make sure you don't reuse them, right? So these are all hard things. So the ways you can simply combat this is, I hate to say password manager, because a lot of people would say, well, of course, a password manager, that's the way to do it. And, then the question becomes, well, which password manager do I choose? There's a lot out there. How do I get ahead of this? But I will say, passwords are probably one of the weakest, they say humans, right? People are the weakest link of the cybersecurity chain. And that's still true. I would say, and that's exacerbated by password management.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. So if we could just do that, I think it'll go a long way. So password managers, right? There's a bunch of them out there. There's free ones that are out there. I think education and teaching people how to make memorable passwords, or what we would call passphrases,
Of course.
right? And I know I'm probably, especially for our cyber audience, they're probably hearing this, right? There's nothing new here, right?
But it's a good reminder.
This is a reminder. These problems still happen, right? It's constant. You hear about all these breaches, and it's like, wow, what was it? Did they infiltrate from, all this advanced attacks? No, it was a password that was just leaked in clear text, right? That's what did it. That's what brought the castle down. So, and then I'll go to the last thing I'll say about passwords, I'll move on, is multi-factor authentication, right? It's another one of these like basic types of activities that a lot of people just don't know what to do. And then when you look at education, I'll even talk to my sister, my mother, and others, MFA, multi-factor, like, what is that? It doesn't mean a lot, right? So it needs to be, I think, people just sort of need to understand that this is the new way of life, multi-factor authentication.
So maybe some storytelling in and around how to use a password correctly, getting after MFA so it's not just a 3-letter acronym that the nerds keep talking about, that you're actually looking at it as something that you want on your side. And I'm curious, as I've looked at some of the operating systems, Apple comes to mind with OS 18 and what they're doing to build passwords into kind of the flow. And you talked about, free. I think things that are built in at the operating system.
Yeah.
You don't think about it. It's just there. You're expected to use it. It supports you.
Yep.
So I think that'll be a huge boon in security from a password standpoint. Maybe you can talk to me about some of the other low cost, no cost resources that schools could go after, that they could bring in, that you think would make an impact.
Yeah. So I can name a couple. And just to extend just a little bit more, I mean, it doesn't stop with passwords, just to go back to that last question, because I don't want to leave it. I would just say regular system updates, right? Because I'm a good cyber citizen, right? So I would be remiss if I didn't mention, right, that you have to, update your systems.
Yeah.
And then regular training and awareness. And last time you and I sat down and spoke, I did speak a little bit about just continuing to raise that, what I like to call cyber aware culture, right? Just making sure everybody knows that security is not restricted to just the IT department or the cyber team. It's a team sport, and everyone's got to get involved. Even you, mom and sister, and everybody's got to get it. So, okay, so free resources, and I'll go back to passwords. There are, you're right, spot on, right? It's ingrained in many operating systems now, so you can take advantage of those capabilities. I won't get into that, but there's a lot of open source password managers as well. Bitwarden comes to mind as being one that's cited often. But I'll also say from a training perspective, and that's why I wanted to go back and make sure I talked a little bit about the cyber aware training. I'm proud to say even Palo Alto Networks has, free cyber training online. In fact, if you go to paloaltonetworks.com, I think it's /cyberpedia, right? There's a host of resources there, everything from intro to cybersecurity to fundamentals of networking to the cloud, and even, those who are a little more want to get into it and understand security operations. There's a SOC, which is Security Operations Center, types of overview and fundamental awareness, right? So that's something anyone can go to and read. But from our friends in the education area that are looking for helpful resources to just sort of organize their thoughts, these are fantastic entry points. That and then I could go on, right? CISA and others, NIST. There's a ton of resources out there. I think the other side of that would be just information overload and just right. How do you organize all that? So I think once you sit down and make an organize from a cyber perspective, organize your thoughts around a cybersecurity program. These would be great entry point resources to go after.
The last time we got together, we talked about this idea of having a AI assistant that rides with you as someone to remind you, maybe, hey, David, don't click that link. Or it's time to update your software, right? Like helps. So I think something like that is sort of future state. I want to go outside of the technology and the policies, and I like the Cyberpedia offer, right? Like those free resources, and talk to you about sitcoms from the 90s and 2000s.
Okay.
So there was this program where drunk driving was a problem. And they're trying to figure out, how do we show a cultural norm is to have a designated driver?
Right.
Seems pretty obvious to me. However, the sitcom became the vehicle where you modeled, we're going to go out, we're going to have some drinks, we're going to have some fun.
Right.
But one of us is going to be the DD. One of us is going to have, Coke at the bar.
Right.
And, it's going to be something that's a celebration of somebody that takes that responsibility. And I wonder if there's an opportunity for us in security to look to culture, to look to entertainment, to look to the types of things that are around us.
Yes.
And to model what it looks like to have a good password manager, to update the software on the fly. What do you think of that idea?
So I like this idea a lot. And let's unpack it a little bit. Let's double click on it, right? So first off, well done to think, because you're right, the sitcoms and all that kind of normalized this designated driver idea, right? It made it like, oh, we should all do this, right? And I can remember, even talking to kids, and it became sort of the norm. It wasn't abnormal to have a designated driver, and all of that. I think the other aspect of this, and I know we're talking about cyber and education, but I'll even take it a step further and say, I think that even the students, right, not only do they need cyber awareness training, passwords and MFA and encryption and things like that, right, being cyber culture aware, but even to the aspect of, am I computing responsibly, right? And I'm just, again, thinking from a student perspective, right?
Right.
Someone's talking to me on Snapchat. Do I know who they are? It's a girl or a guy or someone who shares interests with me, or, and, that's such a problem. Now, I won't go too deep down that, but back to your point, I was chatting with a friend of mine recently. Now, in the high schools, in order for a student to go to prom, right, they have to attend a session where they watch a film about drunk driving, right? And it's interesting because, and it's almost traumatizing in a sense, where kids leave like, oh my God, that was such a hard film to watch, because it goes to a story about, drunk driving. And,
Of course, I think I've seen this.
Yeah, you may have, right? In fact, when students get ready to drive, right, they go to driver's ed, they watch, whatever it was called, the highway movie of driving erratically and all that, right? So what's interesting about that pattern of, we're learning to drive, you should watch a movie about, these are the dangers of driving, right? You're going to go to prom, you should watch a movie about these are the dangers of drinking and driving, and you need to be responsible. And then I was talking with a parent recently about kids learning to compute responsibly, and the dad turned to me and said, Mike, where's the movie? And we were talking about that. And he said, where's the movie about extortion of kids through these online platforms, right? Where's the education knowledge about don't send photos to people you don't know, right? Don't send photos to people you do know, right?
Right.
Don't answer personal questions, when you're having a chat with someone on Snapchat or TikTok and you don't know who they are, right? So I think the levels of awareness, I'm sorry, I'm running a bit of a tangent here, but this is a really important area where I just seen kids, the youth struggling. And, there's a lot of good that social media and computing platforms and all that can do. But I do believe that as an extension of classic cybersecurity, conventional cybersecurity, we have to get into the space of, teaching the next generation how to be just aware of those types of activities.
I couldn't agree more. I took shop class in high school.
Yeah.
And I had to go through
Yes.
how to go to shop class and not have long hair, not have loose clothing.
I watched that movie too.
Right?
Yeah.
Like how not to lose a finger on the bandsaw.
Yeah.
We did all of this. And yet you don't necessarily look at your phone or your tablet or your computer, whatever it is, your social media, as a bandsaw, right? You don't look at it as one of those things that's as dangerous, but it does have those same things where maybe on the how to use it is how to use it safely, and what does responsible use look like? What does safe use look like? And I think that while we were initially talking about like how can schools secure themselves, perhaps there's a jump off point where schools have a responsibility and opportunity to teach how to use these things that are pretty common in our day-to-day lives now.
Yeah.
Social media and applications and different mobile devices in particular, in a safe way, and understanding how those do present risk, how those do present threats to students. The extortion thing is really interesting. It's a conversation that I've had. I've got some teenagers, and we've been very clear of, if you get into a point and somebody's coming back and making those threats, escalate that to the house CISO, me. Let's have a conversation, and not to just over-index on solving it yourself, right?
Yeah.
Like tap into the community here at the school or at home if you need some help.
I do like, and I know I took it kind of down a little bit of a serious route. We're talking about schools showing movies from school perspective. But back to your original point about, what if we normalized it through sitcoms? When you do it that way, right, it could be a little more memorable about, that episode of that show, and it was kind of funny, but don't answer that text, or don't click that link, or, change that, So I do think there's opportunity to do it that way as well.
Yeah, I think they just like baked it in, didn't call attention to it, and then ran it on repeat through a number of shows. And I can't remember if it was a team out of Harvard that came up with the idea, but it ended up being particularly effective. In the show notes, if I can go find this study, I'll definitely put a link into it.
Yeah.
So I want to come back to something you were talking about. There's lots of resources. There's a lot of different controls, whether they're no cost, low cost, or a heavier investment. Can you talk about some of the rubrics that schools can use to create an organization around understanding what they have and what they need and how to best implement it.
Yeah. Especially, and I'll even say it, especially with limited resources, right? Because, and you know, a rubric's a great visualization, a great mental model, right? That you can use to get into something. Listen, I'll take a step back and I'll start with something that I do almost daily, right, for customers, is a risk assessment, a cyber risk assessment, right? So that's, to me, that would almost be like ground floor. You know, if you're an organization and you're trying to understand, you know, where where are the holes in my infrastructure, or, you know, how do I get started, where are vulnerabilities lying? I think just a grounds up, end-to-end cyber risk assessment. And that's something you can do to find significant risks, understand, you know, everything from device management, your network structure, you know, go end-to-end with it. I know it's easy to say, hard to do, but this is one of those things that'll pay off in dividends, because if you do it once, it gets easier to do over and over again, right? So you start there. And then I would then, after that, adopt a cybersecurity framework, something like a NIST cybersecurity framework. And I cite NIST because, you know, they're sort of like the de facto standard.
Sure.
And it's out there and everyone can use it. So you take these two things, right? And then you take sort of the sum of, you know, you want sort of the whole to be greater than the sum of the parts, right? So you have your cyber risk assessment as sort of this foundation. You layer on top of that a cybersecurity framework that you then, and you now have a roadmap to, you know, what do I need to do? You know where the holes are from your assessment. You could start to plug those holes using the cybersecurity framework. And to be honest, right, from an educational perspective, there are low-cost resources that are available to them. Schools can work with local governments. Schools can work with private institutions, industry partners to find, you know, resources. Again, I'll go back to like the Cyberpedia type example, but there are resources specifically for universities, colleges, you know, K through 12 that they can go after and get support for implementing. And then I would even say, and then I'll close here, that, you know, get the students involved, right? So if you have an IT club, you have you know, and but the university, right? A lot of the IT staff is students that, you know, that are there working part-time, right? So I think it's a great idea to get them engaged and operationalize that. So
Gregory Jones talked quite a bit about being a welcoming community to your user base to become your team, right? Your security team, and training up a lot of those students to help protect the university, but then to also go home and be that one that was bringing that information to their families. Sometimes they're the most educated on it as they come back from college courses there at Xavier. So I think that really makes sense, and it becomes one of those things that drives the culture outward.
Absolutely.
He also used, and I still love this idea, but you know, little roadside signs, you know, the little ones that you stick into the grass. As a reminder that things were coming up, and don't click that, and make sure to redo your password. And I was just blown away of like, you know, it's low cost, but it's effective.
It's effective.
People
right?
are walking across and they're like, oh yeah, I got to change my password. It's password change day or whatever it is. It's sort of wild.
You know, we're in in August right now. Okay. I was trying to think. October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. That's it's one of my favorite times of the year, just saying.
Yeah. So thinking about some of the challenges that universities and high schools face, maybe elementary, maybe not so much now that we've kind of reared back from remote learning in those contexts, but it's certainly a big piece of how universities operate. Can you talk about some of the particular challenges that remote learning poses to the students, to the faculty, to the organization? And how do you mitigate some of those things?
Yeah, we could definitely step through some of that, right? So for starters, when you have remote learning, I think, and this may be obvious to some of our cyber audience out there, right? But the attack surface just expands all of a sudden. When you have people learning remotely even, right? The attack surface expands. Now, what's interesting, if you just compare and contrast those two, right? Remote workers, when we went, remote, there was a lot of training. Don't do this, don't do that. Here's equipment for you, and so on. And from a learning perspective, a lot of students don't get that, or maybe limited fashion. So things like VPN, endpoint enforcement, managed devices whenever possible, right? So a lot of that is somewhat, I don't want to say foreign, but it may not be top of mind for students. They get a laptop for their, as a graduation gift, and they go bring that to college, and off you go. So the advice is, for remote, so that's one of the challenges. And the advice on this like expanded attack surface would be for institutions to implement virtual private networks wherever possible, understand managed devices, and whenever possible, allow students to use what I would call school managed devices, right? So these are devices that might have some kind of, endpoint protection installed on them already. Some of the other things, though, that plague the remote learning population would be phishing campaigns, right? And they're getting, and you and I talked about this, with AI now, phishing campaigns are getting a little more sophisticated, harder to detect. So to mitigate that, you need to implement email filtering. And again, I know I'm saying things to our cyber audience that might be, come on, Mike, this is, but I go out and I talk with institutions, and it's just still just continuous problems. These are just areas that need improvement. And then the last thing I'll say, two more things, actually. One more is data protection, right? So when you're in a remote environment and you're accessing, I remember, when my kids were home and it was Moodle and Classroom and, this and that. And what was amazing to me was, well, this teacher's using this and that teacher's using that. And which one do we use? And it's not standardized. I know a lot of that's worked itself out, but you have these platforms and you don't really know what's going on under the hood, right? Are they encrypted in transit or at rest? Are they compliant with regulatory like GDPR and what's the one, FERPA, right? That's the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, right? It's another one where just protecting the data of students and parents and things like that. So you have all of this. And then again, I started with it and I'll close with it, is the home network, right? So students are at home, right? And they probably have a router, which they got at the local electronics store, and they plugged it in. Maybe they didn't change the password on it. Maybe they're using devices that don't have security on them. So I just think education guidelines for how to have a secure home network, would go a long way in helping with remote learning.
Mike, you mentioned phishing, and I think that that's always one of those top vectors that we see at least in the top 5. I'm curious, thoughts on training up the staff in particular, maybe the students as well, on ways to identify a phish, avoid those scams.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that.
Yeah, again, right, another area that continuously plagues, businesses as well as, but I think schools are especially susceptible to it because they don't get, in some cases, they may not get the constant reminders, or maybe they don't have simulation in place. But you're absolutely right. Awareness training, simulations, early and often, and then reporting on that, I think would go a long way. And, I was at a conference recently where I gave a talk to a bunch of professionals, and I was just talking about like phishing and deepfake. And I did it in such a way where I showed examples. And the reason why I bring that up is the feedback I had gotten was, wow, I'm so much more, now that I know what's possible, I feel like I'm much better equipped and much better aware. So the advice I would give is educate people, not just on this is what phishing is and, how to identify links and the language and all that other stuff, but let them know what's possible, what adversaries are actually using, and show them examples. And more importantly, show them examples of the after effects of, if you did click this link, this is potentially what could happen, right? I think that would go a long way and would resonate more and longer, for students and faculty and staff.
So here at Black Hat, we've recorded a number of podcasts, and I was talking to our colleague, Chris Tillett. He talked about the need to contextualize the impact of your security decision, whether that's to put in a control, a policy, or to, as we've talked about, click the phishing link and then understand what happens.
Yeah.
And I think that storytelling and that ability to make it not abstract, but pertinent to what I'm doing in the moment is the theme that I'm getting, is driving this closer to something that I care about rather than something that I have to tolerate.
Yes. I love that, actually. Let me just say that back again so I can steal that. Is that okay if I steal that?
Absolutely.
Because make it something I care about versus something I tolerate, right? I think that's just that statement right there could underpin a lot of activities in cyber, and probably even more.
So if that phishing campaign or the Mission Impossible style attack that's very sophisticated leads to a data breach, what are some of the things that schools can do to take to mitigate or shrink the damage that occurs in a data breach?
Yeah. Okay. So again, I'll try to. We could have a conference just on that topic, right? But I'll break it down into threes because I like things in threes. So I'll start by saying something like, and I'll even put on my zero trust hat for a second, role-based authentication, or I'll even go further and say least privilege, right? That right there would go a long way in, I think, mitigating data breaches for institutions. And, again, let's just say, well, private companies are not excluded from this, by the way, but yeah, role-based, that's RBAC, what we call RBAC or role-based authentication, right? You're a teacher, you have access to teacher things, right? I'm a student, I have access to student things. Just we have certain roles and we have access to certain things and keep it there. And then if you go further and implement least privilege, which is the concept of you only have access to just enough. And when I say just enough access to applications or access to data, access to systems, right? Where you have just enough access to get done what you need to do. So as a student, I should only have just enough access to submit my assignments and maybe research some things, but not go and explore all these other areas, right? So least privileged are back. Next thing would be encryption. We talked a little bit about this before, but encryption in transit and encryption on rest. What does that mean? Again, all our cyber listeners are probably well aware of this, but just using HTTPS, right? Making sure you're connected to secure protocols, and when data is at rest in a system, it's encrypted, right? And I already sort of mentioned it, but secure channels, that would be the third thing. So virtual private networks, making sure you're using, you're communicating with the school only over a secured channel. It's okay to sit in the library or even sit in the coffee shop. I was at one this morning, right? But if you're connected to public Wi-Fi, you need to make sure that you're doing it over a VPN, right? And you're using secure channels. And if you are connecting to a public network, you need to do it in a way where you're sure that where it's a trusted public network, so you can avoid those man-in-the-middle type attacks that often happen.
So you've talked about some back to basics, some fundamentals, getting into a level of discipline as you approach securing educational institutions. But they're weird in the sense that you've got temporary staff, you've got students that are coming in, maybe they're staying till graduation, but maybe they're not. Maybe they're just going to be there for a semester or two. Maybe they go home for a bit and they're not part of the network. They're not part of the institution for a bit, but then they come back, right? Like whatever was going on in their lives, they're able to pick up their education again. And then you've got researchers and parts of the university that are looking for the full exposure to the internet, able to use any application that they need because their job, their goal is completely different than yours in security.
That's right. Yeah.
How do you bring those two things together? How do you strike that balance such that you're able to allow for education to occur, research to occur, a vibrant digital community to flourish inside of this construct of an educational institution, while also not exposing it to the dirty, nasty part of the world that we live in that will harm you?
Yeah. So I draw an analogy because it's very often, and I like the way you said, the role of teachers and professors and all that is to teach, right? And that's what they want to do, and we shouldn't prevent them from doing that. They should have access to tools and tech and the resources they need in order to do that effectively. And very often when I'm working with customers and clients, they'll say, well, you know what? I have a team that needs to innovate. They need to move at light speed, and security can't slow them down. So it's almost a very similar,
parallel.
Parallel. Thank you. Right. That to what's happening there. And so the answer to that, it's almost the same answer, right? It's and I've corrected myself because I would say things like, I think frictionless security could be a real thing, and I've gotten into great debates over this concept of frictionless, but I think we can do things to make security less friction, right? Maybe not frictionless, right? Because, but less friction. And I also think, and we talk about this term in cyber called shift left. So this is the idea of taking security concepts and pulling it, shifting it closer to where it originates. So when I go and I talk with people who are, using AI and doing a lot of innovation, and they say, I can't worry about security because I need to move at the rate and pace of the market, right? So I say, well, there's things we can do that are very fundamental, that are not frictionless, but are less friction that you can do now, right? By just, taking a breath, and you can still move fast, right? So, and examples of that are like many that we talked about, just making sure the data you're using is good quality data, making sure if you're going to go use that AI model, right, make sure it's of good pedigree and you know where it came from and you're not just randomly, just basic conventional housekeeping type of things. That same philosophy applies in the education space, right? And we need to help professors and teachers and staff, equip them with, the guidelines and the boundary, the guardrails, right? So you doesn't need to be a toll booth, but I think you need a guardrail. Easy to say, but hard to do sometimes.
I like the idea of shifting left and getting to a point where somebody understands why the security is there. I'll go back and, Gregory Jones gave me this idea, so credit to him. And as the students come in, before they're able to attach the network, really get going with their studies, they go through a very brief cybersecurity training.
Yeah.
That's the first thing they get.
That's the movie they watch.
It's exactly right. And instead of trying to bolt it on after something bad has happened, they start with hey, here's this device. It's very powerful. It connects to the internet.
Yeah.
You're going to have email. You're going to have all kinds of phishing, whatever it is coming at you. Here's the things to keep in mind just to get you moving in that right direction. I think that's a really powerful shift.
Yeah.
So Mike, let's look out to the future a little bit and think about some of the emerging cybersecurity trends that you see that you think educational institutions should really be keeping an eye on. And those could be advances in technology, or those could be shifting threats, TTPs, that you think are really worth having another look at.
Yeah, I mean, there's the obvious one, right, that everyone's talking about is AI, right? And I could talk all day about AI, but you know what, I think I'll glaze over it a little. I mean, I have to mention it because obviously it's a technology, and for educational institutions, AI poses a bunch of different challenges for them. Everything from our students using it in their day-to-day, it's grappling with the fact that it's here to stay, and how do we morph, and how do we change, and how do we adapt and overcome, and all these different things, right? So there's that, and then of course there's the cyber aspect of it. There's adversaries using it in attacks, and then there's adversaries attacking it, right? So if you're making use of it, it's being attacked, and so on and so forth, right? So you have those aspects of it that are definitely challenging, and people need to, everyone needs to kind of have their eye on that. But if I push that aside a second, and I think about, and again, we could even go into Moore's Law, we could talk about quantum, we could talk, all about these things. I'll go back to, again, some basics, threat intelligence. I just want to talk about that for a second. When we think about, phishing campaigns, right? What's the latest phishing campaigns that are plaguing, educational environments? How do I understand that? What are some things I should look out for? What's the latest malware that's floating around out there? Is there one that's more, that would target schools more than others? Are there threat actor groups doing things? And so on and so forth. So a lot of this is rooted in just threat intelligence. And so I think we talked about earlier about, setting up a cybersecurity program, doing a cyber assessment, and then building, sort of foundational awareness and all of that. I think threat intelligence needs to be a part of that equation as well. And so while threat intelligence in and of itself is not emerging new technology, the content of it is always going to be new and emerging. So that's one area, I think, where it gets often overlooked. There's tons of free resources on threat intelligence. So there's paid for services, obviously, and then there's open source threat intel. And I think the challenging part of that, especially for institutions that might be resource constrained, would be, again, information overload and taking the time to curate it, and bring it together. And what are the ones that make sense to me? If I'm a university or from.
But if I go back to the AI comment for just a second, there may be a moment where you could say, "Help me find relevant to me."
Yes.
In the threat feeds, paid or free.
Yes.
That are targeting or about educational institutions as the thing that I want to see escalated first. And maybe even going to that point where you're saying, and how do we, with our particular version of a network, our particular community, community, how do we prep for that? How do we prepare for that? How do we look for that in our signatures, or in the space that we do have? So it seems to me like maybe as much as you glossed over AI for a second, threat intel plus some of these new tools applied in a different way gives an advantage back to this side of the equation.
I'm really glad you went there because you're absolutely right. So I did glaze over the AI, but you're correct. If you take something like threat intel, which someone may say, oh, well, that's something old, and you add it to something new like AI, you could get this net new force multiplier, right? Where you're now exponentially ahead of the curve. And I think that's an area where, like you said, I think paid for or free, right? If you're curating, right, but you're using AI to help with the hard stuff, which is how do I know it's relevant to me? How do I know how to curate it? And then how do I put it in the context of my world? So if you had an AI that understood your world, right, your community, your architectures, your environment, the tools that you're using, the policies you have in place, right, you can fine-tune a model that has understanding of that, a local model, by the way, right, or even one in the cloud. And again, I could talk all day about that because I'm very passionate about fine-tuning models and making them do very task-specific things. But yeah, I feel like there's a space there for acceleration. So very
That's
cool.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Mike, thanks for coming on Threat Vector. As always, wide-ranging, awesome conversation.
Appreciate it.
I've got the best job in the house. I get to come in and talk to people like you and ask my questions and become more educated. And that's just catnip for me, man.
Likewise, I appreciate the time here. I would love to close to any of my educational folks out there, that are listening to this, that I understand, protecting a school from cyber threats, right? Or institutions like this from cyber threats may feel a lot like, guarding a fortress with just a drawbridge made of spaghetti, right? I mean, just to kind of put a visualization out there. By the way, we're getting close to lunch, so I'm hungry. But I promise, if you take some of the basics that we've talked about, right, with some of the accelerators of new technology that's coming out, and you bring it together, and I'll go back to something I said in the beginning, you really can make the whole greater than the sum of the parts,
So well put.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks for the time.
Mike, it's always a pleasure having you on Threat Vector, especially on such a critical topic of securing our educational institutions. As we discussed, the educational sector faces unique constraints where its budgets are limited, there's a complexity in managing the diverse user base and the ever-expanding attack surface due to remote learning. But your emphasis on proactive security measures, role-based access, and the importance of a cyber-aware culture really provide a roadmap for these institutions to follow. Your analogy of guarding a fortress with a drawbridge made of spaghetti perfectly captures the daunting tasks schools are facing. But as you highlighted, by focusing on the basics like password management, multi-factor authentication, and ongoing education, while leveraging new technologies like AI for threat intelligence, education institutions can significantly enhance their security posture. To all our listeners, whether you're working in education or just interested in cybersecurity, the key takeaway from today's conversation is the power of combining fundamental security practices with emerging technologies. This approach not only helps mitigate risks, but also builds a resilient foundation for the future. Mike, thank you again for making this complex subject more approachable. We look forward to having you back on the show soon. That's it for today. If you like what you heard, please subscribe wherever you listen and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Your review and feedback really do help us determine what you want to hear about. If you want to reach out to me directly, email me at threatvector@paloaltonetworks.com. I want to thank our executive producer, Mike Heller, our content and production teams, which include Kenny Miller, Joe Benecourt, and Virginia Tran. Elliot Peltzman edits Threat Vector and mixes our audio. We'll be back in 1 week. Until then, stay secure, stay vigilant. Goodbye for now.